All right, so if everybody could just take their seats quickly, we're going to start. We have an amazing panel that's going to be moderated by our own Bill Bernay, who obviously needs no introduction. And I'll just set the stage for this panel on historical highlights to simply make the point that if parental alienation just describes a psychosocial dynamic in family systems, then it obviously was not invented by Dr. Gardner, who put a label on it. And even the family systems theorists of the 70s, part of mainstream psychology, who were able to come up with concepts like a pathological alliance, didn't invent it. It just has its roots in human nature. And that should lend credence to all of our efforts and push back on the detractors. But we have a panel where we're going to talk about the history of it in support of that assertion, and Bill's going to moderate it. So without further ado.
So here we are, we're winding down from our 3 days. And what we had in mind as we wind down is we'd kind of like to move from the history, even though this is called the historical highlights, our general thrust is to transition from the past to the present to the future. And in fact, the events later this afternoon are parental alienation in the media, which I hope has a big bearing on the future as to how we deal with the media in the future. And finally, the presentation by David Curl on the 10 strategies to conquer parental alienation obviously has something to do with the future. So this is kind of the transition hour. And what I want the presenters to do is to try to make a little bit of a connection. In other words, each of them is talking about some kind of historical event or a historical person, or themselves. In some cases, it's themselves who is the historical person, but maybe they can help transition us from the past to the present to the future. So with that in mind, I had a theme in mind for this hour. In fact, here it is. Somehow I changed the slide automatically, but there it is. Or I changed it accidentally. So I have this idea of standing on the shoulders of giants is kind of what we're talking about here. And, you know, we all rely on the wonderful people who have gone before us, and we build on what they have done. And I think this is kind of a neat theme for the afternoon here of our last day. So lots of people have said this. Obviously, I didn't invent this, but and it appears in literature frequently. But it's said, if you Google this term, you would learn that the most famous person to ever talk about standing on the shoulders of giants was Isaac Newton, in a letter that he wrote to a friend of his. And you know who he was talking about. He was talking about Galileo. I forget the exact year. I think it might have been 1632 or 1634. But I think that Galileo died in the same year that Isaac Newton was born. And Galileo, of course, made it possible to understand the physical nature of the solar system. You know, it goes around the sun, and there are moons that go around Jupiter. And then Isaac Newton put that information into mathematics. Anyway, so that's supposedly the most famous person who ever said that. But that's not where this phrase started. So in your mind, guess where this phrase started, standing on the shoulders of giants. And some of you may have visited at some time or other the Chartres Cathedral, which I have a little picture of something here having to do with that. Let's try this device. There we go. This is the Cathedral at Chartres. And I'm not sure how well you can see this, but I'm going to dwell on this for just a moment because I just think it's neat. over here in this stained glass window, up here is Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and this is the prophet Jeremiah. And he's not standing on his shoulders, but he's sitting on his shoulders. And this was in 1265. And so this, allegedly, the abbot of the cathedral liked this phrase and this metaphor, and so he had them do this window. So anyway, I'm just trying to tell you that's what we're talking about today. So the first person we're going to talk about is, I guess it seems sort of obvious that we should say something about Richard Gardner and standing on his shoulders. And here's a pretty good picture of him. Obviously, Dr. Gardner isn't able to be here in person, but he's going to be represented by Demosthenes Lorandos. And just to kind of give you a framework, this is really the thing. I'm going to try to illustrate some of the things that these people are noted for. And this, of course, was his paper that was published in 1985 in this journal called the Academy Journal. If you Google the Academy Journal, you get the newsletter of the of West Point Academy, Military Academy. That's happens to be the name of their newsletter, but it's also the newsletter of the New York Academy of Psychoanalysis. And so this was the article that published where he first used the word parental alienation syndrome, and Dr. Lorandos is going to say a few words of his relationship to Dr. Gardner.
Okay, well, back in the early 1990s, Richard Gardner and I became friends. And we became friends when Richard Gardner and I did cases together. And on one occasion, I traveled to see him in his office in New Jersey. And on the first occasion, I traveled there many times, but on the first occasion, I was there, and this was at a time when Richard had decided that the books that he was going to publish were being purchased by a selected niche of people, that they were being written for a specific group of folks, and why have them published by a large publishing firm that would take 65%, 70% of the profit and send him only X amount when he already knew who was going to publish them. So he created his own publishing company for many, although he published many, many things in peer-reviewed journals, he created his own publishing company to publish his successive books. And so I remember being at Richard's office with my wife, Patricia, and Richard was finishing up in his consulting room with the family he was consulting with, and then in another room he had two women in IBM Selectric typewriters, this is back in the day, typing away like mad, and Richard was sort of overdue to come out and talk to me and my wife Patricia and deal with what we were dealing with. We were at the beginning stages of the first international handbook and conceptualizing what we wanted to go into that, and I'm patrilinearly Greek, and so I get it's somewhat emotional about these things, and occasionally I tend to be a little bit on the over-the-top side, as you could probably remember. So at one point, I'm waiting for Richard to come out, and I see this cheesy, old, goofy Samsonite briefcase. You know those old, goofy ones from the 70s, and they were just hollow plastic with the little clip things on them, and inside there was nothing except two pocket dictating machines. I looked at that and I went, oh my God, Patty, come here. And Patty comes, what? And I said, oh my God, look at this. And Richard comes bolting out of his office, running and goes, what? I said, look, we're at the very seat of the Richard Gardner Publishing Empire. He goes, oh, cut it out, and goes back into his office. So a while later, I would have arguments with Richard, and we would carry on these sort of battles over the telephone, right? He'd come to Michigan, or I'd go to New Jersey, and we would have these battles about things. And as we were developing the first handbook in the early 2000s, we made a bet, and I insisted that I was Greek and we invented logic and philosophy and all that sort of thing, so I was right. And he said, no, you're full of it, and no, you're not right. So we had this back and forth bet about something, and Richard lost. And so the idea was that the guy that lost the bet had to buy the other guy dinner. So Richard said, okay, you won the bet. I'm taking you to dinner. So we went out to dinner, and I said, Richard, I didn't think that you were really going to follow through on this. And he said, yes, of course. Come on in. And I said, Richard, as a Greek guy, I want you to know that, gestures of respect like this are really important to me. He goes, yeah, I get it. I'm buying dinner. Come on and sit down. And I sit in a restaurant, and it looks really kind of weird to me. And I look around in this restaurant, and I say, what is this? He goes, it's a Turkish restaurant. So we go back and forth. We go back and forth around and around and around. I go back to Michigan, and I would get these phone calls. I would get Terry Campbell and I, the empiricist psychologist, and I would be having these knockdown, drag-out fights as we were building the first edition of our book together. And then I would, and my secretary would freak out about that and hide under her desk. And then every once in a while, she would get these phone calls, and she would pick up the phone, and there'd be this guy giggling, and she'd go, oh, I know who this is. And she'd press the intercom. Dr. Larandos? Yeah, it's Dr. Gardner. So I'd pick up the phone, and I'd hear, after a few seconds of giggling, I would hear this. Richard would say his favorite joke of the week. I would get a call from Richard, and it would be his favorite joke of the week. So Richard, who was really a card in so many ways, Richard would call me up, tell me his favorite joke. I would tell him my favorite joke, and we do these dueling Jewish accents. Richard, of course, would always win that one since he was genetically closer to that than I was, being a Greek Australian guy. So he called me up and he go, I just want you to know that Dr. Cohen really loved his father. And I said, what? Yes, Dr. Cohen really loved his father. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, he got this beautiful woman, and he sent her to the rest home where Mr. Cohen was, and she was dressed up in this wonder. She had this beautiful happy birthday sash on, and she goes up to the door. She knocks on the door, and she says, this old guy opens the door and goes, hello? And this woman says, Mr. Cohen, I'm a present from your son, Dr. Cohen, and I'm a birthday present for you, and I'm here to give you super sex. The guy goes, what? Mr. Cohen, I'm a present from your son, Dr. Cohen, and he loves you so much. I'm a happy birthday present for you. I'm here to give you super sex. I think I'll have the soup.
Thanks to the Australian guy. That was nice. So in your mind, you might try to think who might be next. Well, actually, you could have looked in the program, I suppose, and figured this out. But anyway, the next pillar or the next giant on whose shoulders we need to think about is Barry Bricklin. Barry Bricklin was a psychologist who actually is from Philadelphia, and he still is. He lives in Philadelphia now. He was not able to be here in person today because of some health issues. But for a couple of our panelists, what we're doing is we're having somebody else, Barry Bricklin, sent us a statement, a little statement for us to read, written by him. And so we've arranged for that to be read by Lou Pilla. Now, I tried to figure out some rationale for who would read what statements, and this was simple enough that they both come from Philadelphia, or actually they both come from Philadelphia suburbs is probably a better way to put it, and so I don't know, it just seemed to me, it sort of made sense. But let me make sure you know what Dr. Bricklin did. He was a psychologist, and he had the idea that in doing child custody evaluations, there should be some sort of testing mechanism, some sort of psychological test that measures the child's relationship to the mom and the dad, because he thought that in some subtle way children presumably have a better relationship with one parent than the other. So he devised several tests. And one of them is called the Brooklyn Perceptual Scale. And in this, you ask the child a number of questions. I think the question that I'm about to tell you about is, if you had to go away for a few days, would you trust your father to take care of your dog for you? So that's that question, very specific thing. The psychologist asks the child, and then what happens is there's this thing, you put this in front, this little card, and you say, here is trusting your father very well, and here is trusting your father not so well. And the child has a pointy thing, and the pointy thing actually sticks a hole in this line. And if you look on the other side of this, you can measure where that hole is, you know, in one from one extreme to the other. Anyway, this was a somewhat quantitative. It's partly subjective because the psychologist actually reads the questions, but it's somewhat objective, and the kid, you can measure where on the line that is. So that's why we selected Barry Bricklin, and that's why Dr. Pilla, or Lou Pilla, is going to read Bricklin's remarks.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Bricklin has called this My History with Parental Alienation, so I have a few paragraphs to read here. Long before I was aware of parental alienation or knew of Richard Gardner's work, I was well aware of the damage that can be done by feeding a person a continual flood of outright lies, half-truths, and selected truths by my therapeutic work in the 1960s with victims of cult practices. Since I then had a daily radio program with my wife, Dr. Pat Bricklin, carried by CBS, I became the go-to guy for cult casualties. I spent a lot of time reading up on the very scant deprogramming and reprogram research available at the time. Then as now, therapeutic successes were achieved, but hard to come by. I ultimately met Richard Gardner in person at one of his seminars and went on to have many phone conversations with him over a long span of years, from his glory years to when he was, stupidly and misguidedly, under siege. However, my first extended thinking about child-parent relations came from a series of in-person conversations with Anna Freud. I was introduced to her by my mentor, physicist turned psychoanalyst Robert Walder, who had a close and long relationship with Sigmund Freud. Dr. Walder, who had been a practicing physicist, was the first to tell me that Albert Einstein was an early victim of what we now call parental alienation. Complaining to a friend, Fritz Haber, that his wife was, quote, systematically poisoning, end quote, his relationship with his son, quote, so that he will no longer trust me. I had extended conversations with Anna Freud, and I learned a lot from her. But I ultimately thought she failed to see the real importance of both parents. This bias led to her concept of the psychological parent. I subscribe to the neurolinguistic programming law of requisite variety, a maxim that says the more styles a child of 6 or more has to deal with, the better. Even styles that are occasionally less than ideal, though not abusive. This is what is required in the world that every child will eventually have to deal with, a multitude of styles. The extra affection that comes from 2 parents rather than 1, plus extended family, also helps. Before I ever met Richard Gardner, I had already recognized through my growing experiences doing custody evaluations that children were attributing statements and behaviors to parents that seemed unlikely to have happened. His work and the quality of his thinking deepened my interest in parental alienation. I continued my search for signs and patterns in both tests and real-life settings that pinpointed children's assertions that were not based on actual interactions, NBOAI, with a parent being criticized. Several patterns emerged and were published. NBOAI, a phrase that will never be adopted, is far more scientifically accurate than parental alienation when referring to what a child asserts about a parent. I also saw that diagnosing the presence of parental alienation was easier than proving its causes, and that these two processes should be considered separate processes. The presence of parental alienation throws very little light on its multiple causes, and the untangling of the long web of actions and counteractions that follow from the initial signs of parental alienation requires tremendous expertise. I further learned that the depth and persistence of parental alienation follows more from a child's perception of the degree of pain and anguish seen in the alienating parent than from the number and quality of the alienating tactics employed. Once a child adopts the role of savior and guardian of the weak and the victimized, it's hard to pry the child out of that role. I learned in court that the judge is often more persuaded to side with the targeted parent when the evaluator details how much less the favored parent is doing to help the family situation than would be expected from a truly loving parent, rather than when the evaluator details only who caused the parental alienation. Thanks.
Thank you, Lou. So I don't know if you really gathered an important thing here, but in their early work, Gardner in New Jersey and Brooklyn here in Pennsylvania were somewhat independently, I think somewhat independently, figuring out or noticing the same thing, that in some custody situations, the child gravitates to one parent and refuses the other parent. And then eventually they got to know each other and they quoted each other. So thank you. Oh, incidentally, the comment about Albert Einstein, so that's come up. A number of people have talked about that. There's this famous recent biography of Albert Einstein that has the letter in it, the correspondence, and talks about it a little bit. So that the idea that Einstein was a victim of parental alienation has become a little bit of a part of the generally accepted mythology of this topic. Anyway, that's interesting. It's interesting that Brooklyn knew somebody who knew Einstein. So, our next champion that we want to talk about is Wilfred. Wilfred von Bach-Gallo is a psychiatrist. Is a psychiatrist in Germany, and he's going to stay where he is. But just let me mention a couple of things about Wilfred. It is interesting. I mean, obviously Gardner is an important thread in all of what we do, but Wilfred also got to know Richard Gardner in a way that he's going to explain, I think. But these are a couple of books that Wilfred has been responsible for. This book over here, which I think is actually on a table out in the book fair, are the proceedings of the conference that Wilfred von Bach-Gallo and a couple of other people put together in 2002. This conference took place in Frankfurt, Germany, and Gardner was one of the featured speakers, and later, when that was all over, they put this together in a book. And then here's another book that Wilfred has written that he might want to tell you about. Please.
I'm Wilfred from Germany, and I'm an adult psychiatrist. So I went into my practice in 1979, and I've worked with adult children, alienated children, and with traumatized fathers and mothers. And I've seen in these, especially adult children, all the symptoms which Amy Baker has described so perfectly. At the beginning, I didn't know what to do with these people. I hadn't heard a bit from parental alienation, but I didn't know what it really was. We had two articles from Ursula Kodjo and Peter Köppel. They had written extensively 2 articles about PAS. These articles I had read, and in these articles the name from Richard Gardner was spelled. So I decided to drive to New Jersey and to visit Richard Gardner, and he invited me for dinner, and we talked about 3 or 4 hours about parental alienation. So I really had the feeling this is a man on whose shoulder you can stand afterwards in your practice. Then we had the idea with a little group of psychologists and an attorney to invite Richard Gardner for a congress in Frankfurt in 2002, 1 year after he died. And he said, I don't come if you don't talk from parental alienation syndrome. But he came and he brought with him Richard Warshak, Dr. Barden, Lena Hellblom Sjögren from Sweden, and Pamela from Rachel Foundation. And I see these concepts today coming up to the table, whereas in Germany, after flourishing, after this Congress, PA flourished. It came into commentaries, articles were wrote, but after 5 years, the professional scenery was telling nonsense, you're ideologists, and it disappeared from the German scenery under the table. It comes up from under the table now, where it is in ICD 11. This is a very hopeful sign for us in Germany, and we begin again to use the notion parental alienation, and we try to explain it to professionals and so on. So, what I wanted to say, I had the impression that Dr. Gardner was really alone fighting an issue which today we are 150 people and many specialists refining the diagnostics and everything. So for us today, it's easier than for him fighting against many people. I understood what he suffered. I looked at the website of the World Health Organization when we discussed the ICD-11 entrance of parental alienation. A shitstorm from all over the world, broke down over Dr. Burnett. All of us, but many of you, had supported this, and I think this was very, very important, at least for us in Europe. So this is what my remembrance of Dr. Gardner was. And it was very sad that in 2003 he died suddenly. But he was a very humorful, intelligent, and I liked him very much.
Thank you, Wilford. So as you can imagine, there really are many, many people that we could have chosen to be on our list of participants today. And this next year we'll have more of these, but let me go on to the next person for right now. So the next person is somebody that maybe is not as well known to this audience. His name is David Levy, and he was an attorney who was a child and family advocate. I think he was located either in Washington or maybe in Maryland, nearby Maryland. But what he did is he helped start, or he did start, this organization called the Children's Rights Council, which happened, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, and it is still active. But somebody who knew, Mr. Levy is deceased, but somebody who knew him and worked with him is Mark Roseman. Mark is a psychologist from Florida, and we're delighted that he could be here today to tell us about his friend.
Number 3. Testing. Oh, hello. Earth to Mars, Earth to Mars. David Levy. David Levy, I'm going to share with you for these few minutes. I think you will find him to be more of an icon than you might immediately think if you haven't heard his name, certainly. In 1997, following my divorce, I was seeking resources, I was seeking information, I was seeking help to remain involved in my children's life, and I found out about a conference in New York where there were a number of speakers, including Warren Farrell, and it was in Elmont, New York, a small conference, and a gentleman, a very tall, gregarious man, effervescent smile, spoke. That was David Levy. And after his presentation, I spoke with him briefly, and he said, well, why don't you come to Washington and visit? Well, I did, and I stayed for 6 years. So let me tell you about David. Richard Sauber, Dr. Richard Sauber, called David Levy the king of joint custody. When I asked David's widow, Ellen, to describe David, she had written to me saying, what I feel the most, always, is David's kindness and unconditional love for his children. Also, I think he was open to people because of their emotional issues and not despite them. I was in David's office when Richard Gardner's son called to tell David that Richard Gardner had passed away. And it was a frightening moment, and I saw David turn ashen. I had never seen him do this before, and I have seen David in many, many circumstances, which I'll relate to you shortly. But he felt that the PAS effort was even more challenged. In 1985, David co-founded, as Dr. Burnett said, he co-founded what was then called the National Council for Children's Rights, and later it was called the Children's Rights Council. And the Children's Rights Council sought to do several things. One, to advocate the rights of children to have two parents in their lives, and also to bring to the attention of the family courts that parental alienation was a real concept when parents are being pushed away from their children, when children are being brainwashed, and there needs to be attention to this, as was said earlier today, this scourge. Well, the Children's Rights Council was very important in creating national conferences, and I worked in D.C. I served as Assistant Director for Child Access, and I also managed and helped expand the role of the conferences, which I'll tell you about momentarily. But I did want to say, David was hailed by Rodale Press's magazine, Children Health Magazine, in 2009 as one of the top 25 people to help child outcomes in the last 50 years. Until his passing in December 2014, David was the international face of joint custody, for he was honored by the ambassadors of France and the UK for his leading role in advocating national policies for shared parenting, not only in this country, in this hemisphere, but in Europe. For years, with David's leadership, the national conferences and also regular press conferences on Capitol Hill, where David loved to take me to meet senators and committee leaders who were influential in national policy on children's issues. For many years, these conferences brought forth those that were on the cutting edge with research and with information and with the most important proof that parental alienation not only existed, but in fact demanded the attention of courts both throughout the states and also throughout the country. It was David's efforts and his recognition as being such a leader that he was brought to bring testimony to state legislatures, and I accompanied him on many of them, certainly to get experience, also invited to speak in different aspects of his testimony, but certainly to learn from this majestic man who brought joint custody to the United States and to 30 states. And you must remember David Levy for this effort. And still 20 states do not have shared parenting or co-parenting or joint custody laws. Being here at this conference reminds me greatly of the CRC's conferences. And having worked with David, we decided we needed to expand the attendance at these conferences. It was not enough to have those change makers who naturally seem to be the policy makers, the legislators, the family attorneys, court judges, and therapists. That was not enough. We needed the educators. We needed the researchers. We needed the faith-based community. We needed the medical practitioners. We needed everybody that works with families to be educated and to commit themselves in working holistically and helping to bring about the changes that this society requires. Friends, this society is imploding. If 30% of people going through divorce are experiencing conflict, are experiencing parental alienation, if you see the statistics, which the Department of HHS has said, and that is the increase in drug and alcohol abuse, suicides, the truancy is in 30% of around the country, and clearly our society is imploding. If we do not have changes, then you know what? We're our own worst terrorists, is what I say. I had the pleasure, thank you, I had the pleasure of meeting at our conferences so many wonderful people. A number of them are here. Dr. Amy Baker, Richard Warshak, certainly I met Richard Gardner, Dr. Burnett, Richard Sauber, who's a very dear friend and a mentor of mine. And it was at one of our conferences, I think it was 2005 or 6, it was Robert Bauserman who produced the first longitudinal study of joint custody and outcomes, which gave the support that joint custody or shared parenting today is vital for children. I'm delighted. I helped run the largest network of supervised visitation locations in the country. That's what the CRC also did. We were advocates, we were programming, and now I have the largest, I understand it's the largest supervised visitation and reunification program in Florida, which we are replicating in other states. this year. We're already in Connecticut. We're pushing forward there. But I want to tell you that it's a great pleasure to bring forth the story of David Levy, who I had the honor of living with. I spent 4 days a week in their home for 6 years, and that was my family. So I want to thank you all. You're my family.
So this is a picture of a child psychiatrist named John Dunn. He's not real famous, but when I tell you what he did, I think you may remember this story in a minute. John and I are actually friends from the child psychiatry organizations, and he's retired, and he's in Seattle, and he's not able to be here today either because of medical issues. But he's going to be represented today by Stephen Morrison, who will very ably read a statement that John sent here. Actually, I'll tell you how the two of them are connected. I think there's a little bit of a connection, simply because they both were very early researchers. As you know, Dr. Morrison, in his PhD thesis, made a study of parental alienation that was interesting and really important when it happened. Dr. Dunn did something similar that when I tell you, you might remember it. He and this lady named Marcia Hedrick wrote this article, which was published in 1994. Now notice, this is only a few years after Gardner published his paper in 1985, but he and his colleague, Dr. Hedrick, got together 16 cases. This was only a few years later. They got together 16 families, 16 cases in which the children manifested parental alienation and the same symptoms that Gardner had described only a few years previously. So they were very early in identifying this problem, and they attempted treatment. I'm not going to tell you how that turned out right now. I think maybe Dr. Morrison might say something about that. But Stephen is going to read the letter that Dr. Dunn sent to us.
Thank you. When Bill asked me to first read this statement to you about Dr. Dunn, I took and went out and did a little bit of exploring to see a little bit about his background. And I found out that his research project, it took place in '92 is when it was published, and he was from Seattle. I think what's important about that is that during that time frame, what it shared to us or told us is that PA wasn't just locally occurring in New York. And here we are today with our communications at this conference where we know it's a global issue. And with that, let me read the words of Dr. Dunn. Parental alienation following divorce has been described during the 1960s along with the dynamic of one parent's hostility towards the other. Dr. Richard Gardner expanded the definition of parental alienation syndrome, and his broad concept of parental alienation syndrome has been widely criticized in both legal and mental health communities. In the 1990s, I began seeing an upsurge of cases where children had become alienated from one parent. These cases appeared in the context of court-ordered parenting evaluations, the Washington state equivalent of custody evaluations. Not all of these children had a parent who could be considered alienating. A colleague, Dr. Marcia Hedrick, whose practice was limited to parental alienation evaluations, also had noticed a similar surge. By 1990, parental alienation syndrome had already become a controversial issue. We decided to pool our cases to see what we could learn since we had MMPI and MCMI testing on both parents, as well as thorough clinical assessments in every case. Dr. Janice Mayberry, another colleague who encountered similar cases in her therapy practice, contributed 2 cases, giving us a total of 16 cases involving at least one child who irrationally rejected one parent, generally creating fabrications to justify their rejection. Interesting, in one of my cases involving 4 children, the oldest child, a boy of 14, rejected his father during the course of the evaluation. I had the opportunity to interview the boy before and after the rejection, which occurred after the father threatened to jail the mother, a paranoid, reclusive woman who violating their parenting plan by withholding the children. None of the younger children in the family had a similar rejection. We had selected our cases based on each child's meeting a majority of Dr. Gardner's 14 criteria. In addition, we collected a number of other variables, including the length of the relationship prior to the separation, the age of the child's parents' separation, and the length of time between the separation and the onset of the alienation. We concluded, and I think this is important, that parental alienation was complex in nature, had many different important routes to the same results, rejecting one parent, and that this severe form of psychological response may not deserve to be classified as a distinct syndrome. Our cases highlighted 2 important dynamics. The motivations of the alienating parent were often strikingly out of the consciousness of that parent, and that the child's own susceptibility to alienation was an important part of the dynamic. One factor that may have had an important role in the upsurge of cases of parental alienation that we observed was the change in the divorce law in Washington State. The Parenting Act of 1987, of which I was one of 4 authors, changed the legal basis for the disposition of child after divorce or any procreative relationship, from property law, a relic of English common law, to social contract law. Some form of this legal shift has been adopted in many other states, at least 2 foreign countries. The theoretical basis for the change grew from the social changes occurring in the country during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The legal change undermined the implicit social contract in which the children would reside with their mother after divorce or after an unwed relationship, and that fathers would pay support in return for limited visitation. According to the change, which threatened the role of mothers, the state legislature decided that a greater proportion of residential time with the father would proportionally reduce the amount of support he would have to pay. This guaranteed that there would be intense legal battles over residential time, often hinging on the question of parental fitness, encouraging vicious accusations about the other parent. Follow-up research supported this impression. Subsequent anecdotal information suggests that the prevalence of parental alienation phenomenon has continued to increase in this state. Perhaps this is another example of unintended consequences. While there is still a great deal more to be said about the topic, further research should focus on the prevalence, epidemiology, and etiology of parental alienation. All right, thank you.
So I guess there are several things that are noticeable here. That first of all, I just got a new watch from Mark. I'll see you later. I'll see you. Well, one thing that's noticeable is that here we have people writing papers 20, 25, even 30 years ago, and it's the same words and the same topic and the same issues and the same concerns. Although I thought it was neat that Dr. Dunn, in his comment at the end, did help us focus on what we still need to do. The research on etiology, prevalence, and so on. And so I think that this kind of soiree here helps us focus both on the past and on the future. So we've been roughly in chronological order, and in fact that's why Olga Odenitz, who is from Paris, That's why she is the final person, because her work is the most recent of all the material that we've been listening to. So this also brings us back to Paris and that cathedral I showed you the picture of, because if you're at Olga's house in Paris and you don't have anything to do for the day, you can take the train down to Chartres and you can look at that stained glass window. So let me explain, well, first of all, here's Olga, but let me explain one of her big accomplishments. There's this organization that she's going to tell you about, which you can pronounce a CALPA, which is a very large, very expansive, very successful child advocacy program in France, which is devoted almost completely to the issues of parental alienation. They've been very influential. They're really a good model on how to create an advocacy system. They've been influential in teaching. They do training with judges and attorneys and law enforcement. They don't call them policemen. They call them something else. But gendarmes, she'll tell you. And it's actually been they have a beautiful website that they've had for years. In other words, it's a really good example of getting an advocacy system off the ground. And also, just a couple of years ago, she and her colleague, whose name is Roland Broca, who's a kind of a famous pediatrician and child analyst in Paris, wrote this book together, which I think is the only book in France that is specifically devoted to parental alienation. So Olga's going to tell us her story.
Well, first of all, thank you. I want to say thank you to you, Bill Burnett, and to all the past PSG members for their dedication and their successful energy. Thank you so much. Well, I never met Dr. Richard Gardner, but definitely I'm standing on somebody's shoulders, and that's the story I will talk to you about. So, 19 years ago, I was going through a very tough divorce, and one Sunday night, my 3 kids came back from their dad's house. I didn't recognize my older daughter. She had empty eyes, and she yelled at me with her father's voice. I thought she has been drugged. Then I remember movies about American soldiers in Korean camps during the war. So I looked through brainwashing, manipulation, and divorce on Google, and I found parental alienation. That was in 2002. And the only reference about parental alienation in Europe was Wilfried's conference in Frankfurt. So I wrote him to get the name of a professional in France, and he gave the name of the psychiatrist Paul Bensoussan. And 1 year later, in December 2003, I have been invited to a TV program dealing with kids' custody and divorce, and Dr. Bensoussan was on stage. So he explained that the behavior of my kids and the loss of my custody was due to a very severe parental alienation. And that was the first time somebody was talking about parental alienation and alienated mother in France. But that was a state channel. And all my critical comments about the family law system have been cut off. Although the website of the TV program bursted out with parental testimonies. So I thought, wow, there were good questions. So I was a biologist by the time working with social responsibility on health and environmental programs. So that day, my life changed, and I switched from environmental research to mental health issues and parental alienation. With a few parents, we founded ACALPA, Association Against Parental Alienation, to maintain the family link. People told me, don't talk about parental alienation. It's a mess. Nobody knows about it. I said, no, I have. If we don't put the word, we'll never get through that. And I am a woman. I am a mother. I can do it. And I will. So we were all volunteers, mothers and fathers, since the beginning, half and half. We struggle a lot to get PA recognized in France. And our specific strategy has been, don't lose your time with detractors, but invite and bring the positive professionals in the big tent, as you told Bill. Dr. Ben-Sasson gave us the first interview for our website. We went like crazy on radio and TV programs. And in 2007, we organized a 2-day congress with the Fondation pour l'Enfance. And everything was already there. The president of the foundation was Anne Giscard d'Estaing, the wife of the former president of France, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. And she told us, they will pay and organize a meeting, but we, ACALPA, if we ACALPA, we were in charge of making the program. So what we did, nobody was talking about parental alienation in France any longer, so we called professionals from Germany, Ursula Kojo, and a very famous judge at that time from Belgium, and they explained what parental alienation syndrome is to 300 professionals in the conference. The psychiatrist, Dr. Ron Broca, did a fantastic job helping us building out the Congress program at that time. And after this Congress, we went through 5 golden years for PA awareness in France. I was invited to train police investigators, and ACALPA organized many seminars and colloquium for professionals, psychologists, attorneys. In 2015, Dr. Broca called me to write the book, Séparation. This book that was Séparation conflictuelle and aliénation parentale. So I didn't want to write this book just he and me. I invited different experts to comment parents' testimonies inside the book, and in all the field dealing with child custody in France. And this book is still frequently used for attorney training. We have a second print this year of this book. But a few years ago, the government changed in France, and the traditional family became a kind of old-fashioned model. And nowadays, unfortunately, we're facing a historical anti-PA campaign, and no way to get politics inside our tent. So we just try to keep them far away of us, not to mess inside our tent, if you understand what I mean. So, so we just go on working with open-minded professionals like Marie-France Irigoyen, and of course helping the targeted parents and families. I want to say thank you to Dr. Broca. He's not here, but he did a great job because he trusted us, and he opened not only his mind, his heart, but his house too. We had so many meetings with dinners at his home. So I say thank to him, and thank to all the people on the shoulders of them I'm standing up, of which I'm standing up.
You know, I'd like to mention, Olga mentioned this psychiatrist who has worked with her, whose name is Paul Bensison, something, yeah, Bensison, I think is the best way to say it. But I'd like to mention that Dr. Bensison is a forensic psychiatrist in France, and he has received a medal for not just for being a nice guy, but specifically for his work as a forensic psychiatrist. It's an interesting story, all what happened. I'm not going to enter right now, but he got the Légion d'honneur, the Legion of Honor medal from the French government because of his work in this field, in forensic psychiatry. So I just think in this country that some of the psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers and nurses should get a medal now and then for what we're doing. Also, I'll just mention that Olga and Dr. Bensison and Dr. Broca and John Dunn and Bricklin and Demos are all members. They were all essentially founding members of Parental Alienation Study Group. So please, if you haven't joined yet, join up. The easiest way to do that is you can go to the website and simply say contact us and we'll figure out what to do, or you can send me an email. Thank you very much for your attention today and the last few days. Thank you.